So 18,000 applicants. About 12,000 of those were qualified. So 1/3 were not qualified. That's the typical rate when we put out an astronaut announcement. About 1/3 of the people who apply don't meet the qualifications. A lot of people want to get a copy of the rejection letter through the process, just so they can post that on their wall that they were rejected.
Welcome to the All in Recruitment podcast by Manatal, where we explore best practices, learnings, and trends with leaders in the recruitment space. If you like our content, please subscribe to our channels on YouTube and Spotify to stay tuned for our weekly episodes. I'm your host, Lydia, and with us today is Brady Pyle, Vice President of HR for Space Center Houston and retired NASA HR executive. Pleasure to have you with us today, Brady.
It's a pleasure to be here, Lydia. Thank you.
So, NASA Space Center Houston, there's so many questions to ask, right? So I can't wait to dive in. And I want to know, just to start off, right? So what are some key areas of priority for you at Space Center Houston? What makes your role special here after you've retired from NASA and spent quite a bit of time there?
Right. I was brought here to help Space Center Houston sustain their strong organization culture as they prepare for significant growth. So Space Center Houston's a small nonprofit organization. We have about 160 full-time employees, another 200 or so part-time and seasonal employees. So it's great to be here to bring lessons from NASA to this role, and then also remain connected to NASA. Space Center Houston is the official visitor center for the Johnson Space Center here in Houston. So nice to remain connected in that way.
Is it close to, in terms of proximity and geography, is it close? So you still get to go back?
It's right across the street, and Space Center Houston sends trams on site. It's the only way visitors can get on site to the Johnson Space Center is through Space Center Houston and our tram tours.
Well, what are some areas of priority that you've set for this growth that you're going to see in Space Center Houston?
So we've set in place a leadership development strategy to really grow our leaders. We've also put in place a talent strategy principle that we will fill half of our new positions with internal talent. So we're putting in place HR strategies to really grow the talent and capabilities of people that are on board today, grow and expand leadership capabilities through new courses, through mentoring and coaching as well. Those are some things that we're putting in place now to sustain that culture and that growth going forward.
It's Brady, you've been with NASA for close to 30 years, right? So in what ways has the role of a HR leader changed in your view?
Yeah, over the course of my career, HR has always been about attracting, developing, and retaining talent and taking care of employees. I think what's changed over the years is a couple of things. One, getting more proactive and data-driven for workforce planning and analysis. And then number two, I think HR's responsibility to steward the organization's culture through policies, programs, and accountability. I think that's really become more of an emphasis, both of those things over the course of my career.
Now, space exploration programs are undoubtedly particularly ambitious, right? So in what ways do these plans actually impact hiring policies or even practices?
Yeah, and space exploration programs are also very long-term. When you think of some of the Space Shuttle program, the International Space Station program, our upcoming Artemis program, these are 30-year programs. So you really have to take a long-term view of the organization and when you're looking for the right skills and capabilities. So NASA hires government employees. Government employees, the vast majority are going to stay for 30 years. And so you've got to be real strategic around, do you need this particular skill for 30 years? If you don't, we have a variety of relationships with contractor companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and a lot of smaller companies too, that can hire different skills, and we can leverage our prime contracts to get skills. So it's a very long-term planning process, and then you've got to be very strategic when you're going to hire someone into NASA versus leveraging that skill through our contractor community.
We'll move into the point of continuity for these programs later. But in terms of defining and setting a workforce strategy, how do you go about defining and setting a workforce strategy, maybe in your experience at NASA?
Yeah, so my experience was you just had to bring the right leaders across the organization together to look at what you needed. And there was a big prioritization process. When I worked at the Johnson Space Center, we had a workforce of about 3,000 employees. And one of my previous HR leaders used to say, hey, if you pulled the frontline supervisors, we would need 1,000 more people all the time because there's always more work than people. But that's why you get a management structure in place of division level, director level, and ultimately the center director at the Johnson Space Center makes decisions about hiring priorities. So you bring the people together, get the information, and then you work up the management chain to prioritize and really understand the skills that you need over the long run for these space exploration programs.
What are some elements that go into assessing future talent needs in the area of human spaceflight? I understand that it is ultimately a long-term plan, right? Do those elements or those factors remain as they are, or do they change in this course of time?
Yeah, I think one of the things we really look for is the enduring elements of our culture. And so NASA really hires for its core values. It's looking for people who demonstrate excellence, people who have integrity, people who perform safely, and then also teamwork is a huge core value of NASA. So when we're assessing talent, we're looking for that track record of excellence. Do they have the technical discipline competency that we need? And do they have a record of achieving that over time? And then also we're looking for people who are team players and can excel in an environment of teamwork. Some of the smartest people that we find out in the market are great individual contributors, but they won't be good at NASA because they don't work well in teams. And so that's a big part of our hiring process as well.
How do you assess that in terms of the hiring process, in terms of the length, or making sure you've got really the right kind of person to stay with you for the course of 30 years, for instance, 10, 20 years maybe?
So we do a couple of things. We tend to have people interview with a variety of people in the organization, and we get multiple perspectives, but we use behaviorally based interviews. We look for assessing what have you done. We don't ask questions like what would you do or what is your philosophy. We want to know what has the individual done in their career. How have they worked in teams? What have they accomplished technically? And what we're listening for in a lot of cases is the we language of teamwork. We accomplish this as a team. People who talk about their own accomplishments, you can kind of parse those out from the candidates who talk more from a teamwork perspective.
And you've also talked about culture fit, or rather the team mindset comes into, it's front and center for the kind of candidate that you look for, right? So let's move into the selection process. Who are the key people or the key segments that you would hire for? And maybe walk us through a little bit about the selection process for astronauts, for instance. I mean, this is first thing you would think of, right? In NASA, and it's astronauts. So what goes into the selection process for an astronaut?
Yeah, astronauts are they're the face of human spaceflight and the face of NASA. And so astronaut selection and hiring is very unique, and it's very different compared to other roles at NASA. We invest a lot in making sure we get the right people in the astronaut position. So if I rewind and kind of look at our 2017 process, we had more than 18,000 applicants. And that was partly due to, that was around the time there was a movie called The Martian that starred Matt Damon. And people could see themselves as an astronaut on Mars. It kind of gives that unique picture, a unique insight into an astronaut's life, if you will. And so 18,000 applicants, about 12,000 of those were qualified. So 1/3 were not qualified. That's the typical rate when we put out an astronaut announcement. About 1/3 of the people who apply don't meet the qualifications. A lot of people want to get a copy of the rejection letter through the process, just so they can post that on their wall that they were rejected for an ad copy.
Interesting.
But we had, of the 12,000, we had 75 HR professionals actually go through and sort those candidates into discipline groups. So we're looking for pilots, flight test engineers, biological and medical science, physical science, engineering, and operations. When we did that, there were about 440 highly qualified applicants. We conducted 11 weeks of interviews. So our first round interviews, we brought in 120 of those 440, whittled that down to 50 for the second round. We had psychological, behavioral, medical testing that was split between those first and second round interviews. A lot of those tests occurred during the second round because of the expense involved in those tests. We had 616 tests that involved people from 23 different institutions, and ultimately ended up selecting 12 for that class. We had 6 people from the military, 6 were civilian. We had 5 women selected because part of this class is the Artemis program, and we have a commitment through Artemis to put the first woman and the first person of color on the moon. So really intentional about getting women and people of color into the astronaut corps. Then in June of 2017, Vice President Pence actually introduced the class. That introduction reached almost 2 billion people in social media. And then we had almost 1 million live views of that event. So a lot of interest and a lot of excitement around the 12 astronauts who were selected.
So 18,000 applicants, down to 12 astronauts selected, and then beamed again to 2 billion people who are going to see their potential and possibly their face over there. So there's a lot of anticipation built. Now, going back to the 75 HR executives that look through these applications, what is the actual impact in terms of operations on HR when it comes to the selection process?
Well, of course, astronaut selection is our highest priority. So other priorities that we might have take a back seat in the process. So we had 75 of our team members. We had about 400 team members at the time. So a little less than a quarter of our team was dedicated for a 2-week process of reviewing those 12,000 and coming down to the highly qualified list. So a lot of effort. We want each application to be individually read. It was actually individually read by 2 different HR professionals. So we had a couple of folks looking at each application to make sure that we were moving through that process appropriately.
Is there any use of HR technology or recruitment technology in this whole process being so critical to the mission? Is there a kind of filter or technological use at that early stage?
So we collected the applications and the information electronically, but we actually had humans look at each application. And this is consistent with benchmarking that we had done with Google, where Google actually reviews each application by person. And we figure if Google is doing that and not using technology to evaluate candidates, there's something to pay attention to there.
Moving on to senior leadership at NASA. So what might be a differentiating mindset for a senior leader in this institution? And how might this be evaluated? And what might be some questions that you would ask?
So senior leaders at NASA need to really fit the culture of inclusion and innovation. So they need to embrace diverse perspectives. They need to encourage innovation and creativity. And they need to help others be their best. So again, we'll use behaviorally based interview questions to focus on kind of what they've accomplished. And we say, hey, tell me about a time when you've encouraged creativity in your team. What were the results? How you embraced diverse perspectives in your role. What did that look like? And what were the results? Describe a time when you helped one of your team members become their best and perform at their best level. And so, we want to hear those kind of examples and and real accomplishments in order to assess, do they fit our culture of inclusion and innovation?
And speaking of inclusion, how do you go about promoting an inclusive culture at NASA or even Space Center Houston?
Yeah, and I would say first, teamwork is just such an imperative at NASA. It's just part of the fabric. We want everyone to. Some of our employee engagement surveys, our inclusion index scores a few years ago were best in the government. They were at about 80%. No one else in the government was that high. But when our leadership looked at that, they said, okay, but we're 80%. That means 1 in 5 of our employees does not feel included. So let's take a hard look at that. How can we make improvements to drive more inclusion across the organization? The last survey data I saw when I left, the inclusion index was up just over 85%. And this is across a 18,000 member workforce. So, I think it just shows if you really focus on it and focus to improve and focus on involving everyone, you do make improvements. And that's what I saw over the last several years.
Now, a key point you brought up earlier was continuity and staying through that long period for every plan that comes from the human spaceflight program, right? So succession planning is obviously critical for continuity. So how do you approach, or did you approach succession planning for key leadership roles or even any role within the human spaceflight program?
Yeah, so first, our philosophy was to grow leaders at all levels and increase the capacity of leadership for each of our leaders. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the 70-20-10 approach that we adopted from the Center for Creative Leadership. So one of the things we do from a succession planning discussion is we'll have the senior leaders get together and talk about the pool of candidates that they have on their teams. And we'll look at, what kind of assignments do they need to really grow and improve in their roles and build capabilities? Do they need mentoring? Is there specific mentoring that they may need? Are there leadership training, leadership classes that they need? We've also leveraged the organization Better Up that does virtual executive coaching and paired executive coaches with leaders at various levels to improve their capabilities as well. So we're looking at building those capabilities up, but the discussions among those senior leaders were key because they would give perceptions about potential leaders in the pool, and then HR would collect that data and then work with the supervisors to have a development conversation with the employee of, here's how you're perceived, here's the suggested development opportunities. And that information was invaluable to different leaders. I know for me, growing up in the organization, it was invaluable to hear perceptions, things I needed to work on, things I needed to focus on to develop and grow in the organization. So developing those growth plans with that data was very helpful to our succession planning processes.
The space exploration programs and the human spaceflight program is obviously one of those unique spaces in which you're dealing with unknowns, right? There's so many things that you may be discovering along the course of 2 decades, for instance. So what are some strategies when it comes to collaborating with technical teams to understand and maybe support their talent needs? I know in terms of selection of astronauts, there might be some criteria, but are there any other strategies that might go into this?
Yeah, I think from my experience, from the HR perspective, our HR business partner model was huge in making sure that HR understands the business and the mission of the organization. And then the HR business partners would be at the table describing what kind of talent strategies were needed, or they could translate different talent strategies that we were delivering from an asset perspective to the organization. At times, it's figuring out where do you bring internal talent to meet an organization's needs. Other times, it's developing longer-term strategies. How do we develop a pipeline starting with internships or pipeline of college students coming in because we're going to see kind of longer-term needs of the organization, or rotation programs. We use the development rotation programs a lot to bring talent from different areas and bring different perspectives to bear, and then to grow talent capabilities across the organization as well. So key part of that model, they were kind of the hub to figure out how to connect the dots to support the mission.
And in terms of data and analytics to support these decisions or to support this kind of planning, so to what extent has it made an impact? And now we're seeing so many different technologies, right, that come into play. So to what extent has data and analytics impacted these practices that are already there in NASA?
Yeah, I think data and analytics have allowed us to make better decisions. We're moving toward data-driven decisions instead of hunches or making decisions by anecdote. I think the technology and the data and the analytics have also helped us advance our workforce strategy and workforce planning capabilities. The more data we have, the more credibility we have at the table, particularly when you're dealing with technical leaders and rocket scientists who are looking for certain talent solutions and strategies. When you come to the table with data, you have more credibility in those discussions.
Going back to employee engagement, are there any fundamental factors that would keep employees motivated and make it consistent throughout this period? Is there something that really drives those who work at NASA or even Space Center Houston?
Yeah, it's really pretty simple. It's the mission of the organization. People want to be part of NASA because NASA is a civilian government agency that is trying to explore and discover the unknown, but also do things that improve life on Earth. So a lot of the technologies that are being developed for spaceflight end up benefiting us here on Earth. And so a lot of people want to be part of that. For Space Center Houston, people want to be part of an organization that brings people in space closer together. That's kind of our mission here, is to inspire more students to study in the STEM field: science, technology, engineering, and math. And so both organizations have very exciting missions to be part of. And I think that's why both organizations have a track record of attracting and retaining talent.
Really, you would also probably see a vast difference in the kinds of generations that join NASA, right? You've got the entry level, and then you've got super senior ones who, so many different generations are within the workforce now. And NASA or anything related to space exploration is certainly, a dream for lots of them. What are some ways to manage or even facilitate this coming together of different generations within an institution?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we, at one point, we had a formal mentoring program that was branded after the Star Wars character Yoda. Your opportunity to develop another, and it was designed like Yoda for older employees to mentor and teach younger employees. We actually worked with Lucasfilms, and they developed a little pen that we gave our mentors, a Yoda pen. But what we found after a couple of years of that, and in staying in tune with the research, is that mentoring programs are most effective when it's a dual learning. Each party is learning from one another. And so we actually had to step away from the Yoda branding because that was getting in the way of kind of the dual learning and sharing, and really promoted a new mentoring program that was, we had some reverse mentoring where junior employees would mentor executives. We had that cross mentoring where sharing with one another became more of an emphasis. And so I think we're learning how to operate in this intergenerational environment as we go, but we've learned some lessons along the way by stubbing our toes a few times, I think.
And has the in post-COVID now, has COVID had any kind of impact, and what is the impact of maybe these different work arrangements that we're seeing now, hybrid, remote? Has that had any impact on how the workforce is set over there?
Yeah, so that it had a lot of impact, I would say, on just again that culture of teamwork that is kind of the fabric of NASA. A lot of that is built through kind of in-person relationships and interactions. And so when we went into the work from home mode, team members that knew each other well did okay during that remote work time. It was harder as we brought new employees into the organization, harder for them to get oriented and to really feel part of the team. So post-COVID, a lot of our workforce has come back on site at NASA, and that was an emphasis to a lot of our workforce works with hardware and systems and tools where they need to be on site and need to be interacting with one another. What was lost in the COVID time that's hard to replicate is the hallway conversations among technical folks, particularly if they had a technical concern. May not be a big enough concern to raise to management, but you might have a hallway chat with a colleague about, hey, I'm kind of concerned about this. And we lost that in COVID because everything became more formal meetings. It was hard to replicate that informal gathering space, which is critical to human spaceflight, because when people have concerns or issues, those need to be explored. And, that was a big concern among NASA leadership for a period of time there, is that we were losing out on some good sharing of information.
And was there a workaround for that, or was there some kind of solution, or did that just have to go through the process of it?
Yeah, we kind of just had to work through it. There wasn't an easy way again to replicate that yet. I think leaders tried to encourage people to interact more informally where they could, but for a lot of our engineers, being remote and at home, they would focus on tasks and may not have the same level of interaction they have in person.
Finally, Brady, just to close this off, we've just spoken about the trend that you've gone through, or not a trend, but it's a disruption that we've seen in the recent past. And looking forward, we are also going to see many different changes come in. So in terms of HR, what trends do you foresee for the industry in the near future, at least?
Yeah, I was reading not too long ago, Microsoft has a work trend index where they surveyed 31,000 people across 31 countries, and they looked at trillions of Microsoft 365 productivity signals and labor trends. And so their CEO put out a report and said this new generation of artificial intelligence will remove the drudgery of work and unleash creativity. Talked about there's an enormous opportunity for AI-powered tools to help alleviate digital debt, build AI aptitude, and empower employees. And so I reflected a little bit on that. I mean, generative AI is a huge part of conversations about trends. And I appreciate the bold claim that says, hey, it's going to remove the drudgery of work, is the way they put it. And I can recall, not too many years ago, arguments were made that automation would reduce our work weeks to 30 hours or less. And given productivity gains we would make through automation and technology, and it hadn't quite worked out that way. I think we're working more now with technology and with more information than we were back then. So I think, like a lot of technology advances over time, they can assist you, and generative AI can certainly assist HR professionals, but you have to manage them rather than letting them manage you. That's a big philosophy that NASA uses with robotic technology, is they want people to kind of manage the robotic technology and it to be an assistant for human exploration work. And I would have that same philosophy about generative AI, that we've got to stay on top of that and make sure that we're managing it. And it can tremendously help us, do things like write job descriptions, screen, hiring candidates. There's a lot of different possibilities. That's exciting to think about the future of HR with that kind of trend ahead of us.
Has AI, or any kind of AI tool, or even generative AI, in terms of ChatGPT, for example, has there been any kind of introduction of these technologies into your HR process?
So we are dabbling with it with things like job descriptions at Space Center Houston. I know NASA was also trying to figure out how to leverage some of the AI tools, particularly with analytics. There's so many data points and things to look at from a workforce perspective. Can we leverage AI as assistance and summarizing that or simplifying that?
Thank you so much, Brady, for your time and your insights. It's certainly intriguing to find out what the process is like to hire extremely specialized skill, right? And also, what does it take to make them stay for the long haul? And what kind of person would stay for the long haul? And how do you facilitate the different kinds of roles or different types of mindsets that come into an organization or an institution like NASA as well as Space Center Houston? So thank you so much for your time, your generous insights today. For those listening in who want to maybe pick up a conversation with you later, Brady, where can they find you?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. One of the easiest ways to find me is through LinkedIn. I'm out there on LinkedIn and like connecting with people that way and dialoguing that way as well. Learn more about Space Center Houston. We're at spacecenter.org. NASA is obviously at nasa.gov. And I do a blog about leadership on the side that's outofthisworldleadership.com. So a lot of different ways to connect with the different topics we've talked about today.
Right. Yeah. Out of this world leadership is what I was looking at, and I really like that, by the way. So thank you so much, Brady. And we have been in conversation with Brady Pyle, VP of Human Resources for Space Center Houston. Thank you for joining us this week. And remember to subscribe to our channels to stay tuned for more weekly insights from all of you.